Hi there. Hello everyone, it's wonderful to see such a great turnout, so many familiar faces. How are you feeling? You warm? Great. Winter's come upon us very quickly. So no, wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for your interest in what is happening here today. So welcome to a new Gold Rush, our World Heritage. It's a Ballarat Festival event and it's presented by the Eureka Centre. Today we meet on the traditional lands of the Wadawurrung peoples, and I honour and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this to all other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us here today and viewing this online. I'm also proud to acknowledge and pay my respects to the many traditional owners of country, which includes the Victorian Goldfields today. And these are the Barangi Gudgeon, the Dja-Dja-Wurrung, the Wadawurrung, Eastern Ma, Gunakurnai, Tungarung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, Yorta Yorta and other peoples. The mid-19th century gold rushes occurred on First Nations country all around the world, and this story cannot be told without them. Today's session is an opportunity to learn about a project that's underway to list the Victorian Goldfields on the World Heritage List. You'll hear from some renowned experts in World Heritage and academics about what World Heritage does and could mean for our region, and hear how exciting and extraordinary our region's heritage is. We'll begin, and I'm sure many of you know that already, but some people don't realise what's in their own backyard, so I think it'll be fantastic to hear. We're going to begin with an introduction from my colleague, Trevor Budge, and will be followed by our keynote speakers, who will do a short presentation each, and then a panel where I'll ask some questions, and then we're going to throw to you for questions, noting that we don't have a lot of time and we're going to be around afterwards for afternoon tea, so please come up and speak with people afterwards, and there's lots of ways you can get in contact with us as well. So, we're lucky to have 4 fantastic speakers joining us today, and I'm going to begin with an introduction to Trevor Budge. I'll ask Trevor to come up, grab his microphone, and so Trevor is the World Heritage Strategic Projects Officer at City of Greater Bendigo, where he coordinated key strategic projects, including the Goldfields World Heritage Bid and the UNESCO City of Gastronomy. He's a former Associate Professor at Bendigo campus of La Trobe University and Adjunct Professor at RMIT University. He's served as the State President of the Victorian Division of the Planning Institute of Australia for 3 years, and is a Life Fellow and has a National Lifetime Achievement Award from the Planning Institute. Trevor became a member, AM, so I should say Trevor Budge AM, in the General Division of the Order of Australia in June 2011 for services to town planning, particularly the development of regional and rural communities in Victoria, and to education. His involvement in this World Heritage Bid goes right back to when John Brumby and the local community of Maldon, I think it was, started it back in the 1980s. So this has been going on for a long time. And I must say, on a personal note, Trevor's probably the only person I know who just about everyone knows of him, or he knows them, or has taught them every time we go into a meeting. So very happy to present Trevor. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks very much, Sue, and great to see so many people interested in this project. This project, as Sue has indicated, has had a long gestation. The concept of World Heritage listing of the Victorian Goldfields, first of all, was mooted as an idea in the 1980s, and there was a flurry of activity around the late 1980s. Been various stops and starts, and in 2009, the Victorian Government actually put forward the Castlemaine diggings as a World Heritage Site to the Australian Government. I think, fortunately, the Australian Government rejected it on the basis that the Castlemaine diggings in themselves didn't represent the full scale of activity that had happened right across the goldfields. And for all those communities who weren't associated with Castlemaine, that was good news, because you can now be part of the World Heritage listing. So there was 2 things that really happened that have changed the events. One was we got hold of some material which Barry Gamble will talk about later, and that is what had happened in Cornwall, West Devon, where a serial listing approach was used. And so moving from that idea of a single site being able to represent the Victorian Goldfields, we moved to this idea of a serial listing, a linked series of places across the whole Victorian Goldfields that could represent the full totality of what the goldfields meant. That came together sort of, around about 7-8 years ago, and 13 councils bought the idea and they decided to work together. We've now got 15 councils. And then, of course, the Victorian government has come through with some very significant funding and support. One of the other things that happened, which was most fortunate, was that we took the politics out of it, because John Brumby and Dennis Napthine, both real champions of regional Victoria, both got behind the bid and said, we'll be co-patrons, and they've done a lot of work behind the scenes. Importantly, in the development of this project, they emphasised, and we realised, that this is a fantastic regional regeneration concept. And this is not in contradiction of UNESCO's World Heritage approach. This has been used in many parts of the world where the designation of a World Heritage listing has led to regeneration. Economic development, social development, community pride have all come through that process. And so one of the things that we've done, as well as, and you'll hear all about the World Heritage concept itself, but one of the things we've done is to prepare in combination a tourism master plan. And the idea is that how can we disperse the benefits that will come from World Heritage right across the region? How can we grow communities? And I think many of you will be well aware that there are many communities that have got a Goldfields heritage which really are doing it tough. They've got low levels of skill, low levels of opportunity for jobs, and we know from the history and development of other places around the world that World Heritage listing can in fact change communities for the better. And so we'll hear a bit more about that. That's enough from me. I'll hand back to Sue.
Thank you, Trevor, and I hope you look forward to speaking with Trevor more as we move on as well. So now I'd like to welcome our panellists one by one to come on stage and have a bit of a presentation for everyone. Firstly, I'd like to introduce the wonderful Kristal Buckley, AM, and Kristal is was a lecturer in cultural heritage until recently at Deakin University, and is an experienced cultural heritage practitioner with qualifications in the disciplines of anthropology, I'm going to have one of these days, sorry, anthropology, archaeology, and public policy. And her extensive experience includes being on the board of the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority, which is also a World Heritage Site. Also, I said, that's optimistic. She is a World Heritage Site. And they also manage 3 World Heritage Sites in Tasmania. In November 2014, Kristal completed a 9-year term as the International Vice President of ICOMOS, which is one of the World Heritage Advisory bodies, and she is an honorary international member. Having worked in many roles with ICOMOS over the years, she's currently a World Heritage Advisor for the evaluation and conservation of cultural heritage through the implementation of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. She was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 2013 for significant services to conservation and the environment, particularly in the area of cultural heritage and education. There you go. Thanks so much, Kristal.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for inviting me to this event in Ballarat Heritage Festival. So you know all about me. I wasn't quite sure so many things were going to be shared with you, but basically I'm here to give you, at the start of this session, the fastest of fast-track introductions to how World Heritage works and the stage of the World Heritage process that you, the communities of the Victorian Goldfields, are currently in the middle of. It won't be enough time. I'm happy to answer questions and to meet you in afternoon tea. And it's not the last time we're ever going to meet and talk about these things, so don't feel like it's the only opportunity. So I'm just going to share with you some key terms that you've already heard or will hear a lot during the discussion. And as Sue said, I work for ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, based in Paris, who are one of the 3 advisory bodies that do, in a way, the professional technical recommendations on on World Heritage nominations and suggest what the World Heritage Committee might like to do. So let me just share with you a little bit of who does what, because sometimes this can be confusing. And forgive me for giving you slides, but sometimes it helps to be able to see and hear at the same time. The first thing is this idea of state party. This is the Australian government, the Commonwealth government. The state party is in the driver's seat for almost everything to do with the World Heritage Convention. So decisions before, during and after World Heritage inscription are the responsibility, or in fact the obligation, of the Australian government, including things like how things will be managed and protected for the long term. We talk a lot about UNESCO, but in fact the part of UNESCO that we deal with in this process is the World Heritage Centre. It's staffed by UNESCO people and is the secretariat for the convention and not very involved in the evaluation of nominations. They have more of a secretarial role at this point, despite doing many other wonderful things in their larger role. The decisions are made by the World Heritage Committee, not by UNESCO. It's the 21 countries that have been elected at any one time to sit in the World Heritage Committee from all over the world. And the decision about whether any site is eventually inscribed in the World Heritage List will be made by that group of 21 national delegations. And I've already explained ICOMOS and the idea of the advisory body. We make the expert or technical recommendations, which are sometimes or often followed, sometimes not. Okay, so you're at the stage here where we're seeking entry to the Australian tentative list. You can see here the current tentative list for Australia. Maybe not all of you have seen it. Some of these things have been on there for ages and really not moving, and some have been entered recently. It gives an indication of what might be coming. Things have to be on the tentative list for at least 1 year before a nomination can be submitted, but as you see, it doesn't guarantee that a nomination will come soon. These are not evaluated, and the work of documentation required for tentative list is considerably less than for a full nomination, which comes later. So on this slide, you'll see Australia's World Heritage properties and a few facts about World Heritage List properties generally. The nomination process needs a significant amount of additional work following the tentative list achievement. The successful inscription needs to have a thorough comparative analysis, needs to meet the criteria for outstanding universal value, authenticity and integrity. There needs to have clearly mapped and protected boundaries of the areas that will be included, and buffer zones in many cases, and must have adequate protection, management and state of conservation. All of those terms have their own full and rich debate, but I'll press on. This one just gives you in graphic form what outstanding universal value is understood to comprise by the World Heritage Committee. So you can't be found to meet the conditions or requirements of outstanding universal value unless you have all of these things. So the criteria tends to be the main focus because that's the narrative and the evidence and the case that's made, but you really have to have all these things in place before outstanding universal value is considered to be demonstrated. And this is way ahead of where you are now, but because I think perhaps you have questions about it, this is what happens when a nomination is finally submitted for formal evaluation. During that period, a person or persons will come here from ICOMOS, not an Australian or Australians, and have a look at the sites and talk with all stakeholders and traditional owners, communities. There will be anonymous desk reviews done, and a World Heritage panel will meet twice during that period. We always say something around the level of 40 people will work on the file in order to come to a recommendation. Too much information, I know, but ask me if necessary later. And finally, I was asked to explain the idea of serial properties, which Trevor already did for me very well. Basically, this is where there's more than one site or place included in the overall inscription. Sometimes these can be in other countries, or they can be spread all over one country, as our Australian convict sites are. These sites that are chosen have to meet outstanding universal value as a whole, and it is important to define why each place is important. We must have a manageable and a coherent grouping, and if these conditions aren't met, integrity will found to be not yet met, and ICOMOS won't be able to recommend inscription. So it's an incredibly important piece of the work I know you're now doing. That's enough for me. I just wanted to finish by saying I've met a lot of communities around the world and governments working in the way you are today. And I want to say to you that World Heritage is a tool. And if it's used mindfully by communities and governments, it can be transformative for local areas. So I wish you every success and I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristal. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Benjamin Mountford. Many of you who are local may know Ben. Ben's the incoming Director for the Centre of Regional Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences and Associate Professor, I like these titles, thanks Ben, and Associate Professor of History at Australian Catholic University, where he teaches global and imperial Australian and British history. Ben is the author of award-winning book Britain, China and the Colonial Australia, and has co-edited 3 books in the fields of global and imperial history, and is currently co-editor of the Journal of History Australia. And before coming to ACU, he held academic positions and research fellowships at La Trobe University, the Huntington Library in California, Federation University and Corpus Christi College and the University of Oxford. He's currently working on the history of how the 19th century gold rushes impacted Victorian Britain. Thank you so much. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to see so many people here at lunchtime on a weekday, so thank you. I'm glad we're not the only ones that didn't have somewhere more important to be at lunchtime on a weekday, so thank you. Let me just start by thanking the Eureka Centre, acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wadawurrung people, and thanking the delegation. It's a real honour to be able to speak with the World Heritage team. And I guess in a way I've got the fun job today, that I just have to tell you why I think this is interesting history. So I've got the really fun job. And 5 minutes is probably about, the end of 5 minutes, most people tend to sort of glaze over when I start talking anyway, so it's probably the perfect amount of time for me to pitch it to you. But I guess I want to talk about both the significance of this history, this historical moment, this legacy of built heritage and environmental heritage that we live amongst, not just in terms of us and the people who live in the region, but also in terms of its international significance, which of course speaks to the World Heritage bit. And when Sue asked me to do this in a few minutes, I was sort of scratching my head what the best way to do it would be. And so I thought probably I would invoke probably Ballarat's most famous commentator, probably the most famous author in the world when he came here in 1895, Mark Twain, just to give you a little sense about how even then the kind of global significance of this story was resonating. And Mark Twain, for a guy who was here basically for, not very long, I think what he wrote about Ballarat has had a longer legacy than just about anything else. But I think obviously at the time he was one of those really keen observers of human society. We had a picture of Craig's up before. Of course, if you've been to Craig's in the foyer, you'll see that's where Mark Twain stayed. He spoke at the Mechanics Institute. He met various groups in Ballarat, the pioneers from California and Ballarat. Met him, and it really, I guess, in terms of global celebrities, it was one of the great names coming to the city and talking about the region. So I just wanted to really quickly just read you a quick passage from Mark Twain's writing about Ballarat. And by the time he wrote this, there was already a Ballarat in Colorado, which had been named after the city where we are today. And the year after, there would be a new Ballarat in California formed in the Panamint Valley. So the idea that the name was already a kind of household global word by that stage is pretty significant. Some of you will know the Sherlock Holmes story about Ballarat, which when I taught in England, my British students all used to love. And I guess without spoiling the story, the thing is he doesn't need to explain where Ballarat is or what it is. He can just sort of put it in the story and the audience knows what that means. So Twain comes at this time when Ballarat and Bendigo are sort of synonymous with global wealth and global gold seeking. So let me just read a little bit for you from Ballarat. So this is 1895 when he's here. 45 years ago, the site now occupied by the city of Ballarat was a sylvan solitude as quiet as Eden and as lovely. Nobody had ever heard of it. On the 25th of August 1851, the first great gold strike made in Australia was made here. The wandering prospectors who made it scraped up to £2.5 of gold the first day, worth $600. A few days later, the place was a hive, a town. The news of the strike spread everywhere in a sort of instantaneous way. spread like a flash to the very ends of the earth. A celebrity so prompt and so universal has hardly been paralleled in history, perhaps. It was as if the name Ballarat had suddenly been written in the sky, where the whole world could read it at once. Now, he goes in then to very great detail about this wave of human migration, which comes into the Goldfields region. In the interest of time, I'll just skip ahead a tiny little bit. So he talks about that sort of story of gold making the region, making Ballarat in that sense of settler colonialism. But he is also mindful that this was also a very destructive process at the same time, this rapid period of change. So Twain goes on to write, "The grassy and leafy paradise was soon ripped open and lacerated and scarified and gutted in the feverish search for hidden riches. There is nothing like surface mining to snatch the graces and beauties and benighties out of a paradise and make an odious and repulsive spectacle of it." And then really interesting for us, I think, he writes that by the 1890s, people were already kind of struggling to make sense of what this historical moment meant, how they dealt with the legacy of it. So he goes on to write, "What fortunes were made, immigrants got rich while the ship unloaded and reloaded and went back home for good in the same cabin they had come out in. Not all of them, only some. I saw the others in Ballarat myself 45 years later, what were left of them by time and death and the disposition to rove. They were young and gay then, they are patriarchal and grave now. They do not get excited anymore. They talk of the past, they live in it, their life is a dream, a retrospection." And I guess I just wanted to read you this little passage from Twain. It goes on, it's a great piece of literature if you want to read something fun about Ballarat. But I suppose for me, I like it because it sort of talks to maybe the two parts of the story we might want to think about today. And the first, I think, is the Australian but also the international significance of this story. So this is a moment where it obviously means a great deal to those of us who live here, but that's the case for anyone who lives anywhere in any part of the world. What's significant here, I think, is this is a moment that is transformative in terms of human history, but it also has a relevance for us because the people that experience this kind of phenomenal change experience on the kind of scale that we would understand. In the same way that the technological revolution, the revolution in transport and connectivity that we've experienced, I think it's probably one period that really is on par with this period of the gold rushes. So I think there's that part to the story. There's the question of, I think, realising that history is not static. So no one owns this history, no one is the exclusive expert on this history. It changes. It's not exclusively located here. This is a global story. The only copy I've ever read of Carbone's history of the Eureka Stockade that he has signed is in England. The only, I won't go into a topic that I know can be challenging here, but of course there's debates about exactly where the stockade was. You know, these things change and they evolve. Our interests in history change. The sorts of things we're looking for in the past change. And so it's not just about thinking about what that means to us, it's about thinking what these stories will mean to subsequent generations as well. And then my second thing I wanted to say, and now I'll wrap up, is just that question of legacy. You know, even as Mark Twain's saying here, he's thinking about how do these people live and make sense of this enormous historical precedent in their lives. And he goes on to explore how actually many of the people he meets in Ballarat in the 1890s are doing it very tough. You know, they're living beneath this idea of this kind of, you know, golden thread running through Ballarat society, but they're dealing with really significant social and economic issues. And so I think for me, what's exciting about the World Heritage bid is the chance to kind of open up those discussions about, you know, we have this great gift, this great heritage, this great history, but that doesn't hide the fact that we're a community in regional Victoria dealing with really significant social and economic issues. And I think one of the key things about the World Heritage bid is the way that it opens up possibilities for that sort of regeneration that Sue and Trevor mentioned before. So I'll shut up and I'll let more expert people take over, but thank you for letting me talk history for you.
Thanks, Ben. I just said to Ben I could listen to him for hours. He always has a great take on things. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Barry Gamble. Barry, 21 World Heritage bids?
I think so.
17 successful?
So far.
World Heritage is such a different thing to... None of us here probably really understand it Barry does. He's a UK-based independent World Heritage consultant with over 20 years' experience. He's author, coordinator and advisor to multiple successful nominations on the World Heritage List. He's a geographer and a geologist and a specialist in mining heritage, and he works either by himself or as part of a multidisciplinary team. And he's part of our bid team, he's our chief advisor. And his international clients include national and federal state governments throughout Europe and further afield to Japan and all over the place, let's just say. His first involvement in World Heritage was as the principal author of the Cornwall and West Devon mining landscape, which Trevor mentioned, this bid's using that model. And this nomination of an extensive serial cultural landscape uses this particular approach, and it fits where we are today. He's a member of ICOMOS. I can never say this. Tiki. I always get it wrong. Tiki, which is the International Committee for Conservation of Industrial Heritage, and Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks very much, and hello to everyone. I'm from the UK. I breeze in and out of these nominations. I'm not the subject specialist in the Victorian Goldfields. I listen to the experts, and my job is synthesis and putting everything into the international framework. So building on what Kristal has said, World Heritage, building on what Ben has said, significance of the goldfields in the international context. This is where I step in and do my thing. I'm a person of methodical process, diligence in what I do, and I've got a job to do, which is support this team and ultimately ensure that the Victorian Goldfields get a well-justified place on the World Heritage List. I'm very visual in the work that I do. I've got a series of slides here that I'm going to race through at the speed that you'll experience them almost as a movie. World Heritage, my first job was to look at what you have and put this into the international context in what Kristal said is the process of comparative analysis. You all know how important your site is, but we have other important sites around the world. A lot of the work that Ben's done has been on other global gold rushes. When I'm talking about gold rushes, I'm not talking about gold mining sites simply. Gold rushes of this kind, of this international kind, of voluntary migrant gold seekers that came in their hundreds of thousands, began really with the Californian gold rush of 1849 and broadly concluded with the Klondike gold rush at the end of the 19th century. On the World Heritage List, this is the goal of the bid team, to get the Victorian Goldfields on the World Heritage List. We've got Roman gold mining heritage. Here we've got, at the bottom right there, we've got Las Medulas in Spain, a great alluvial mining landscape, much as the hydraulic landscapes we all see in Victoria today. Very, very similar technology, basic technology. And then we've got a recently inscribed, a nomination I was substantially responsible for, which was the Rocha Montana gold mining landscape, Roman gold mining landscape, 7 kilometers of tunnels in Transylvania, now on the World Heritage List, not without its problems, including a massive arbitration case in Washington, which recently concluded with Romania winning against a mining company that was going to completely remove the landscape in 5 big open-cast gold mines. So that was an interesting one. This is another one that's coming to the committee this year. This is Sado Island Gold Mines. This is an Edo period, if you recall the Japanese history, and the great period of isolation, really established with the Tokugawa shogunate, where they kept out, or selectively kept out, and selectively allowed in certain very primitive technologies. There's an alluvial mining landscape that is very similar to Las Medulas, using basic Roman technology, even the underground mining. And what you see in this picture with this mountain sliced in two, that was substantially complete by 1640, that example you see in the photograph. This is another nomination. It began as a gold rush nomination as a joint effort between the United States in Alaska and with Canada in the Yukon Territory, the Great Klondike Gold Rush. So this is the bookend at the end, the other end from, if you think of California 49, Victoria 51. The other end, there's a bunch of gold rushes in between, but the other end is is the Klondike. And this was a nomination that was put forward in several iterations and was finally inscribed last year. Classic location there, Dawson City, built on the permafrost. You can see the subsiding buildings. There's the gold rush landscape, bottom right, and the top right are the trails that come along the Yukon. Very, very famous. 100,000 people attempted the gold rush, 30,000 made it, but it was highly, highly publicized. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, the transmission of news was such that it became so renowned. But it's a magnitude less in terms of scale than what we're talking about in Victoria. Then we've got other gold rushes, New Zealand on the doorstep, of course, there. We've got California, top right. And then we've got what we see here in the Victorian Goldfields. And the purpose of these images is to show you there, you've got rivers in New Zealand and in California that in 1 year, in a flood, a heavy snow melt in California can wipe away the traces of 1,000 men in that river valley in just one season. What we have here is we have evidence of the individual miner on the scale of hundreds of thousands, but working side by side. We all hear about the democratic metal that gold was, the leveler of society, and that can be seen here in Victoria like nowhere else. This is, my job was global comparative analysis, hopping around to the great global gold rushes, very different from gold mining districts, as I mentioned, the global gold rush areas. We see a shared signature to those landscapes. We're talking about landscapes. We're not on the scale of sites. You heard Kristal mention about cultural landscapes, serial listings. You heard about Cornwall, which was my first experience. You get these shared, what are called attributes, these signatures of the landscape. Here you can see the pattern why we needed serial in Victoria. Mining districts, mineral resources, gold rushes, they're not spatially continuous. They're governed by the geology, the topography, and the origin of the gold. The origin of the gold and the way it's found determines the kind of landscapes. It determines the duration of the working of those, the permanency or non-permanency of settlement, and so on. So we have to, with a cultural landscape, we have to understand everything, from the canvas of the geology, the topography, the hydrology, through to the cultural landscapes we experience. Seeing here in Victoria, with that first cultural, that ancient, tens of thousands, 40,000 years, whatever it may be, that first cultural landscape layer of the first peoples, right the way through to a period of significance, which kicks off with the 1851 gold rush. But there's a succession of gold rushes that are triggered throughout Victoria that last for that whole 50-year period. So it's the gold rush is in each place, there'll be a shifting geography with the rushes and the permanency or non-permanency through the specific types of deposits we've got here, from the shallow alluvials to what they call the deep leads beneath those basalt caps, through to these long-standing quartz mines. This is what the landscape looks like. This is what a serial listing looks like. These are the different sorts of features that you'll see. You'll recognize many. Here we've got, I mentioned the geology, topography, and that first landscape layer. You'll recognize many of the features here. Don't have time to describe them. The mines themselves, of course, in all their different styles, from the alluvial to the hard rock. Here are some of the technical features. You know, we have to fill out this application form to UNESCO to fit under well-established and very diligently evaluated criteria. So the technology does play a big part, but not the only part. Here we see the grand spatial plans. You saw the overview to begin with of Ballarat. So we've got these instant golden cities, we've got ghost towns, and we've got very splendid architecture, but very specific architecture. Here is a range of very specific architecture that you'll see in many gold rush places, but some of what you see here you will not see in any gold rush towns. An obvious one, there's a bank there in Tarragona one in Creswick, one up there in Eaglehawk, that have all got smelters attached because the banks, they received the gold from the gold diggers and they turned it into instant cash. There's an example of another component, the infrastructure, railways, roads, water management. You've all heard of the Great Colaban, one of the world's big mining water systems. Then we've got a range of social infrastructure. I mean, we've got associative sites. There's the commemoration in Creswick to the mining disaster. There's the gold discovery site at Malayagal of the welcome stranger. Those discovery sites are very important. You'll see them in Otago. You see them in California. They're really instrumental for gold rushes because they the electricity triggered those massive rushes of people. We're talking about great migrations here, an underrepresented theme on the World Heritage List. Great migrations. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Barry. And it's been extraordinary going around with Barry, having a look at the goldfields, because while we're going to have a very select group of the best to demonstrate some of those things, there's so much in Victoria. There's thousands and thousands of sites and places, and I think it's the collective of them that just shows how extraordinary this area is to be able to tell all of those stories. So thank you again to our amazing presenters. I'm going to invite our panellists to come up and I'll sit down with you. We've heard a lot about World Heritage and it sounds all great, but have you got some examples of sites? I'm thinking Barry, Kristal particularly. Trevor, you've been overseas as well to see some of these, where there's been some fantastic opportunities that have come up. And I'm thinking maybe comparable places around the world. Who'd like to go first?
Barry?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just be, it's an easy choice for me. It was my first nomination 2003 to 2005, which actually brought me to Ballarat to first look at Ballarat and the Victorian Goldfields. And that's the Cornwall and West Devon Mining Landscape World Heritage Site, the model that we've adopted here for the Victorian Goldfields bit. Let me just tell you of a presentation I did in 2016 in Brussels to the European Parliament. We were then part of Europe, and Europe was helping us substantially. Cornwall, like Victoria, some of the areas that I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, was economically deprived. It was in the #1 category for financial assistance with European funds, and we used them wisely. I did a presentation to all the Director Generals of the different departments and announced to them, I was talking about significance and so on, and they frankly weren't listening to me. I then said, in 10 years, we've attracted £100 million, let's say a couple $100 million, in 10 years, and 40% of that came from you, and they all looked up. But that 100 million investment came following World Heritage inscription and would not have happened without it. 30% went into conservation, a huge amount went into, I wouldn't say tourism, I would say visitors, because many of the investments were for infrastructure of great benefit to the community. This was sometimes not introducing new businesses, but sustaining businesses that otherwise would no longer be there. It's a success story, it's one I'm proud of, and it's one I keep close to. I think that was my choice. Thank you.
Thank you. Kristal, did you want to add anything?
Yes, well, it's such a big question, and we don't have a catalogue room of opportunity to speak about them, but the one that will come most readily to my mind is Australia's most recently inscribed World Heritage property, which is the Budgebim Cultural Landscape in southwestern Victoria. And I think they also worked on their nomination off and on for several decades, so that's a trend we unfortunately share in Australian cases. But I think what's been very inspiring about it was entirely First Peoples-led nomination process. The nomination became what the Gunich Mara people wanted to say about their cultural landscape as a past, present and future heritage for their people. And since during the preparation of the nomination, but especially after the inscription on the World Heritage List, I think that community in that area has gone from strength to strength in terms of developing employment opportunities for their own people and others, in terms of developing a range of land management and tourism/visitor facilities and opportunities, and a chance to share their heritage with many, many people from many parts of the world. So I think it's been, for me, an extremely inspiring case, because it shows that you know, the way you do the World Heritage nomination can really set up a whole range of long-term benefits for local people, but also that incredibly important thing of that intercultural dialogue and that international sharing of heritage. And so now people know about Budge Bim. I have people all over the world ask me about it and had I been there. And, you know, I think 10 years ago that would not at all have been the case. So there's many other examples, but I think that's my most favourite one at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you.
The standout I'd like to refer to, Sue, is I had an opportunity last year to go and visit the Northwest Wales, where the recently inscribed slate landscapes. Now, if you've ever been to Northwest Wales, this is one of the most deprived areas in the UK. A backwater almost. And the thing that really struck me was the level of community pride that grew as a result of this. So people who'd spent their entire life in this community and really had walked past the heritage every day and had almost disregarded it, and in fact almost looked down on it as, you know, well, this is just an indication of how deprived we are. All of a sudden, it's on the world stage. They've got people coming from around the world to look at the very thing that they have almost been blasé about for years. The other aspect of this, which was really interesting, was that an element of their World Heritage nomination was to in fact recognise the Welsh language. And this is one of the great concentrations in Wales of people speaking Welsh. Going to the shops and everyone's speaking Welsh. And so they actually put their cultural tradition on the World Heritage nomination. It's part of their statement of outstanding universal value. So this can transcend into other things, and all this has led to so many people that I met who simply said the level of community pride in our area has just gone through the roof.
Well, that's like the miners' right, I think, has come up
Yeah.
for Victoria about, you know, the miners' rights written into the statement at the moment, because it's something that was extraordinary that came out of this period. So, you know, that's going to get a lot of attention as well. I'm going to throw to Ben now. I mean, one of the things that I understand with World Heritage is we can do a research strategy. So there's a lot to get to a nomination and a listing, but most of the work can happen to benefit people after the listing happens. And this research strategy is something that we can really plan to do amazing research moving forward about our area. I'm just wondering if you know of any, you've done a lot of global research, any research gaps that, or things that are missing, or anything else that you can think of from your perspective in this space?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. I mean, I guess the point I wanted to make was, I guess thinking about the sites, folks, as, and you know, I'm amongst experts here on World Heritage, but I think for those of us who approach it fresh is the diversity of the sites. So we probably, when we think World Heritage, we probably have an image of our mind of a sort of stone ruin somewhere, or, but actually that universal value is a very diverse thing in terms of what makes a place valuable. And I think, I mean, in terms of the history of the region, I think, I'm trying not to embarrass my PhD student, so I can say hello everybody. But I mean, I think even in the last few years, the history of the region has been transformed, really. Like, you know, we've got so much interesting new research happening on, and of course this is shaped by the fact we're a community that's changing. You know, I was very lucky to get to spend some time with Weston Bate towards the end of his life, and you know, Weston wrote an amazing history of Ballarat in the 70s. At the time, it was a hugely pioneering history because no one was writing about cities. But Weston was very excited to kind of find out what was next, you know, and I think the way in which the history has changed reflects our changing interest, the changing nature of the community. I mean, I like to sort of think, you know, Ballarat and Bendigo, all these regional towns, Trevor, are probably going through the biggest kind of democratic boom since the gold rush. You know, I mean, even friends of mine who fled the burbs of Melbourne post-COVID, you know, we're going through this period of really rapid change that is maybe correcting a period of demographic decline. You know, we're back in growing very rapidly, and so there needs to be a sort of new history for this new community who's trying to understand the place in which they live. And I mean, just by contrast, I went to an amazing talk not too long ago by Janet McKelman, who's the great professor of population history at the University of Melbourne. And Janet was actually talking about how we'd understand the history of something like Anzac. And Janet's calculations were that on current trends, the population of Australia will resemble, most people will look like they've come from somewhere between South Asia and East Asia in 200 years. So like, how is that population going to understand something like Anzac Day? So I think it's really interesting the way in which these foundational moments, whether it be Eureka or the Gold Rush or Lydiard Street or Pall Mall and Bendigo, you know, how do we find stories where this is still going to have meaning to a very rapidly changing population? And I think it can, but I think that's why I say I think it's good that we have arguments about history, and history changes and it evolves. As soon as it stands still, history gets very irrelevant, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm just going to throw one more question to Kristal, and then I'm going to open up to the room. So Kristal, it's with notice, I hope. World Heritage has changed a little bit recently, particularly around communities and community involvement in the process. Could you just sort of give us a bit of an understanding of why we're doing so much engagement and what we're going, you know, what's really being expected, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
It has perhaps a big answer, but I'll try for a small one.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
When I showed you the who does what slide, many of you might have been saying, well, where's me? Or where's the Victorian government? Where's the local governments of the Goldfields? And where are the communities and First Peoples? So this is a certain trick, because in fact they're not written into the convention at all. And the first 30 years of World Heritage was really a state-to-state get-together of activity and decision-making. But over time, you know, the fact that all heritage places are at their heart local places that are in the lives of communities has been more formally recognised. So that idea of community has been increasingly added to the operational guidelines. So communities are there, and there is an expectation. In fact, new rules came out 2019,
years ago, yep.
Where you actually have to say formally in your nomination document how you've engaged with communities. What did you do? What did they say? What do they want? Who are the people in the communities that have associations and interests in this area? And if that isn't well explained, your questions will come back. So there is a kind of requirement that communities are engaged throughout the process, but also in what happens after World Heritage inscription. So the management system set up for the property is different in every World Heritage place around the world, but it should work here, and it should work for local communities and other communities that have an interest and association with the place. And so again, ICOMOS is very keen to always explore that, both through exchanges of further correspondence, but also in the mission that will eventually come here to have a chat with people and find out more about the local involvement. So it is certainly a huge factor now, and especially, I should say, the need for free, prior, informed consent of any Indigenous peoples. So the engagement here, Sue had out quite an impressive long list of First Peoples involved in this potential nomination, and that's very inspiring for me to hear, and will be inspiring for the global community as well, because that should always be part of how World Heritage nominations are developed.
Thanks so much, Kristal. So one of the things that excites me the most in this is the fact that we're kind of designing this World Heritage bid with all the people we were speaking to. I mean, Barry, you were at the Prospectors and Miners Association last night, and we've, you know, everyone we talk to, it's like, oh, okay, we didn't think of that. How do we put that into the bid? And I think it's one of the most exciting things that we can do through this process is really design it up together. And we've got the state funding that's come through for the bid team who's sitting up here now, and you know, lots of people who are involved in this, and it's really starting now, I think, is the main thing. So I'm going to throw open to you. We started a little bit late, so I do apologise. We've got about 5 or more minutes to sort of go. Is there any burning questions? Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Where do the lives or the life story across these World Heritage places in Victoria fit into the bid. Just as an example, I'm thinking of, say, people that worked in banks, because banks were in all of these places at various times.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good one. Barry, I'm looking at you.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
The first thing from a nomination perspective is we've got to lock this into the tangible, the places. To give you your instance of banks, I showed you there. I mean, banks are a classic early signature at some of the best, earliest buildings you get in any gold rush town. I showed you the specificity of the Victorian banks with the attached smelters. Fantastic. Yes, of course, you know, capitalisation, especially of gold rushes, are hugely important. The people stories will pervade this nomination. It's a cultural landscape right from that first people's layer all the way through to the gold rushes, the ephemeral setting up of the canvas downs to begin with, when they see permanency of a persistence of the gold values, so that it doesn't become a ghost town. You will then understand the contributions, not just the gold seeker, these great migrations we mustn't think of the gold seekers as simply seeking the gold. They're seeking the wealth that comes from the gold and the commercial opportunities. We see the banks, we see the hotels, we see the post offices, the telegraph offices. If you look at the scale of these buildings, of the post offices or the scale, we were in Marybury yesterday, the scale of the railway station, or if we look on Lydia Street, we see the row of 4 banks. This is astonishing because of the wealth, but it brought the people, it brought the population, of which only a very, very small proportion were striking it rich. The majority of people that were making the money were the bankers. They were the provisions for supplies and so on. So the story of those people will be in the narrative, but it's a very concise narrative in our nomination document. But the story of those people will be displayed through places, from the Castlemaine diggings, where you might see a jumble of stones that's actually a bread oven, or a solitary fireplace from what was a bark cabin, through to the hotel that we saw at the beginning, Craig's. So the story of the people will be pervasive. But let me tell you that the biggest opportunity for the story of that people is to be told by the communities when we've got this on the World Heritage List and you have a totally new and interested audience. That's when the story of the people really can be told in its fullest sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going for the first hand up, so thank you. Yep.
Can I just ask, Trevor, at the beginning you mentioned, I thought, John Brumbury, one of the policy candidates or something.
Yeah.
I just want to ask this question, is that surely, in terms of that claim, you also quoted the importance of democracy and what Eureka was about. In terms of physical buildings and structures and all sorts of things, sites within the Eureka Central Victoria and other places in Victoria of the goldfields, are you thinking of bringing the evolution of democracy associated with these goldfields into the story and presentation?
It's embedded, truly.
Yeah, it is embedded. I can't help but tell this story. Supposedly, Mark Twain made the famous comment about Maryborough, that the Maryborough railway station was a station with a town attached. I think there's some emerging evidence he didn't actually say that, but somebody might have said that. But it actually epitomises this whole thing, that how dramatic the change was. And you've hit on one of those changes. The story of, ultimately what happens at Eureka Stockade is predicated initially on a whole series of meetings and rebellions, whether it's the monster meeting at Chewton, whether it's the Red Ribbon Rebellion at Bendigo. But we're finding people are telling us that, at Rushworth there was a protest meeting. There were protest meetings in a lot of places across the goldfields, and that did culminate in quite considerable changes in the history of Victoria. Victoria and the history of democracy universally. So as Barry said, it's embedded in the story. It's part of the reasons why this becomes a significant global story.
And there's buildings and sites about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This lady put her hand up in the middle of that talk, so thank you. You've been noticed. Yep.
So it's just on the built landscape involves all of these things. So I know there's all the other cultural and, but in terms of the built landscape, where does the issue, you talked about changing, evolving history and how the town's evolved, but where does the point of town planning and conservation versus profit and that, where does that come in with both the application and the preservation and management? Because it's such a debate about how much we lose heritage buildings and where does the point come where a town's not involved, we want to preserve the landscape.
Yep, it's a good question.
Good question.
I'm going to throw it to our World Heritage experts.
All right.
Yep.
Well, I mean, I think there may be some perceptions that World Heritage listing freezes everything at a certain moment in time and nothing can ever change again. There's also perceptions that maybe it should do that, but it doesn't. So I think that you asked about things like town planning, state and Australian Commonwealth legislation. These are the ways in which adequate protection is provided for the World Heritage values that are identified when a site is, or a set of sites is inscribed in the World Heritage List. So the protection is provided by the mechanisms you already know well, but those mechanisms will have an added imperative, which is to ensure the safeguarding of the outstanding universal value of the areas that have had a boundary drawn around them and identified as contributory to the outstanding universal value of the serial landscape. So that doesn't mean that nothing can ever change, but it means that that's the first consideration when decisions are being made about change. And you can see this happening in, you don't have to wonder. Go and have a look at what's happened in other Australian World Heritage sites where change has been contemplated and how that change has been negotiated, modified, and in many cases allowed, but only where it's been well documented and understood that the outstanding universal value of the particular thing is not being compromised to any extent whatsoever. So that's a kind of blanket answer. I know what you're talking about, but I also think that it's likely that the serial listing isn't just going to put some huge line around half of Victoria and say that's the Victorian Goldfields cultural landscape, because that would not be a practicable arrangement for protection and management. So, the things that are inside those boundaries will really have to have the protection of outstanding universal value as a primary decision-making basis. So I know that you're probably thinking about some other things that I don't know about, but that's the way it works.
Come and...
Like individual buildings, so like certain, or heritage landscapes, are you in Ballarat? They talk about street landscapes or heritage streetscapes.
Yeah, precincts.
And then everybody comes along and buys and yuckifies the house and changes it. So where does the boundary and where does the universal value come in terms of maintaining that, and yet wanting people to modernise the house and
Sure.
the house?
Can I just give you an example? The city of Bath in England, 120,000 people. The entire city is World Heritage listed. A few years ago, they did a multi-million-pound redevelopment of a shopping centre right in the centre, opposite the railway station. Yes, it was controversial. Yes, it took time to come up with a design that was in keeping with Bath. But here's an example of a city that realised that it needed to redevelop. Huge underground car park, new shops, a modern way of presenting material. But so these changes are happening in cities around the world. At the moment, they're considering a major redevelopment of the soccer field, or was it the rugby field, which is right on the river. So it doesn't freeze things. It, as Kristal says, it gives you another point of reference as to how you evaluate something.
Yeah.
But it's not a soft mechanism either. 2 of the 3 World Heritage properties that have been delisted were delisted because of inappropriate development proposals that weren't modified sufficiently or significantly. So, you know, and as Trevor says, I think my last count, about 50% of the World Heritage List occurs in cities, and a large number of those are very large areas of cities, which isn't something Australia's interested in doing at the moment. So, you know, these are the places, workplaces and residential places of millions of people going about modern 21st century lifestyles, and yet working in ways that really secure what is extremely important about these places. So, you know, I think someone used the word design. It's a really important word in that context, because it's not whether change can happen or not, it's how is it going to happen, and how is it engaging with the values of the place.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really, really sorry that question has pushed us way over time, but we're around and our experts are around, and I really encourage you to come and have a chat and speak to us afterwards. There's food, coffee, tea. I'm having a tea. I'd just like to thank our panel. We've got a website, which I think is up there, goldfieldsworldheritage.com.au. There's a Get Involved page. We're launching a survey shortly, which will be open for 18 months while the whole nomination goes on. We want to hear from you. We want your input. And also your suggestions on how we can do this engagement. We want to hear from you as to how we could actually engage with you better. So I'd now like to conclude the session. We've thanked our panellists. I'd like to thank you all for being here on behalf of the Eureka Centre and the Ballarat Heritage Festival, and I now invite you to come and join us for afternoon tea.